Hi, Scott Dreyer here with Dreyer Coaching, bringing you part 3 of a book study, which I've truly enjoyed, and I'd like to share it with you. This is actually the third part of it, a little installment called Checkmate in Berlin by Giles Milton, a British author. Truly enjoyed this book. Again, this is part 3. Please check parts 1 and 2 if you've not had a chance to see that yet. And just kind of set the stage a little bit. World War II began in 1939. And by 1945, this is what the map looked like. And I was just reading a little commentary just now. It made a comment how sad it is that, in fact, the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War were actually one and the same. There was almost no gap between those two events. Or if there was a gap, maybe it lasted a few hours, but very, very short. And this book by Giles Milton expresses that very, very clearly. So by spring of 45, Hitler's Germany, which at one time had controlled all the way from Moscow over here, all the way to France and Italy, by 45 was being crushed. So by early 45, the red part was still under Nazi control. The Soviet Red Army was called Red Army because communists was coming from this way to Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, because the Soviet Union is over here. And that's why this whole area became communist after World War II, because the Russian army was there because of geography. The longer I live, the more I realize how geography and history are so closely intertwined. And so because, this is the Soviet Union, here's Germany, Eastern Europe had the poor fortune of being between those two superpowers. And so as the Germans retreated, the Russians came in and just stayed there for 40 some years. Meanwhile, British, Canadian and American forces had landed over here in this area, Normandy, in June of 44. And during that previous, 10-month period, had gone through a very long and bloody slog here this way, coming in from the west. This is Berlin. So you see by springtime of 45, it was very clear Hitler's Germany was going to be destroyed, Nazi Germany, with the Russians coming in from the east, the allies, Western allies from the west, like a gigantic vice or a nutcracker. Okay. Now, these two groups, the allies, the Russians, Americans, British, had met earlier at Yalta conference. We discussed that in part 1 of this little mini series. And they had agreed after the war to cut Germany into 4 pieces. It'd be a Russian zone, British zone, American zone. And actually later on, it was decided to add a French zone as well. And this is where it gets kind of confusing. So Germany was cut into 4 occupied zones. Why? Each of these victorious powers got a zone. As I've often told my students, when you win a war, you gain territory. When you lose a war, you lose territory. That's just kind of the way history goes, right? So not only was Germany split into 4 pieces, also Austria was split into 4 occupied zones. Little known fact. Make it even more confusing, Berlin, because Berlin had been Hitler's capital. It too was going to be split into 4 pieces, a Russian zone, French, British, and American zone. But what was confusing is that because Berlin is here in the eastern part of Germany, you had these Western allies, French, British, American, having an occupied zone in Berlin, deep inside Russian zone of East Germany. So that's, we see things went bad very, very quickly. Okay. So I want to read for a moment here, just kind of set the stage as we came to this part here. The Russians coming in from the east, Americans from the west, and in the historical record shows we really could have gotten to Berlin first. There was like one SS regiment near Potsdam, which is the suburbs of Berlin. Otherwise, the road was open. And for a reason that historians still debate, Eisenhower put the brakes on it. So we all know our main goal now is to destroy the Russian military, not just to get to Berlin. 6 months earlier, he had said, oh yeah, Berlin is the big thing, on to Berlin. But then almost inexplicably, he put the brakes on that. And so as he told the American forces to stop, the Russians then came in and were first into Berlin with that iconic picture of the Russian flag being unfurled over the German Reichstag. So I want to kind of set the stage a little bit. As these Russians are coming into Berlin, Hitler could actually hear the Russian artillery just a few blocks away. So this is the reading from the book, a few passages here, a few excerpts from Checkmate in Berlin by Giles Milton. What a great writer. I would highly recommend this book to anybody who wants to know more about things like the end of Nazi Germany, the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War. Where does this Berlin Wall come in? What's this East-West Berlin? What's this East-West Germany? Where does NATO come from? If those are questions that interest you, then this is the book for you if you want a deep dive. So Soviet forces had advanced, this is on page 35. Soviet forces had advanced with lightning speed since launching their offensive in the third week of April, this is 1945. Two huge army groups were converging in the city from the south and east, while a third was wheeling in from the north. On Friday, April 20th, 1940, Hitler's 56th birthday, Marshal Zhukov's 1.5 million strong army had begun shelling the city center from its positions in the northern suburbs. Marshal Zhukov was the premier Russian general of World War II. While Marshal Ivan Konev's forces were approaching the city's southern outskirts, the Red Army had soon encircled the German forces that remained in the city, trapping the beleaguered defenders. So what a birthday party, which Hitler richly deserved. He could hear the artillery shelling Berlin from the suburbs. 9 days later, on April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun inside his fortified bunker that's in Berlin, with Goebbels and Berman acting as witnesses. Goebbels was the so-called Minister of Propaganda. The Fuhrer's hand was shaking so badly that when he signed the register, his signature was illegible. Elsewhere in the bunker, the febrile atmosphere was fueled by alcohol, sex, and blind panic. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, was deeply shocked when she ventured upstairs. Quote, "An erotic fever seemed to have taken possession of everybody," she said. The women had discarded all modesty and were freely exposing their private parts. She knew, as did Hitler, that the curtain was about to fall. So that was late April 45. Let's skip now to page 41. A little bit more here. I'm just getting a few little key points to share with you. Page 41. Shortly after lunch on Monday, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun shook hands with their closest staff before retiring to their private suite. At 3:30, a single shot was heard. When bunker staff entered the room, they found Hitler slumped on a sofa and drenched in blood. He had shot himself through the mouth. His new wife had also killed herself by swallowing a capsule of cyanide. This is April 30th. Next paragraph. Much of Berlin was in Soviet hands by that last in April, but the Reichstag itself was still held by enemy troops. The Reichstag was the German parliament building, which actually I had a chance to visit when I was there in Germany in the 80s. This was the greatest prize for every Soviet soldier because it was an emblem of Nazism, even though it had been scarcely used during the 12 years of the Third Reich. Soviet generals wanted the red banner of victory raised over the building, aware that such an image would send a powerful message to the world. The timing of the Reichstag's capture was also in their minds, the timing. The following morning would be May Day, the Soviet national holiday. To seize the building on such a day would be irresistibly symbolic. So the Russians came in and at the end of April, took over the Reichstag. Ironically, I believe I mentioned this in the last episode, when the Russians got there, they realized, oh, we forgot to bring a camera. My bad, forgot a camera. So an official Soviet army photographer flew back to Moscow, had an uncle who was a tailor, plus he needed a big flag, then smaller flags. He got a red tablecloth, and this tailor uncle stitched on the red, so the yellow hammer and sickle, and then they used that and staged the photograph of unfurling the red flag. And when that picture went around the world, it was very clear, the Soviets have taken over the Reichstag, the war in Germany is essentially over, and it's very clear that Berlin is in Allied hands, Russian hands. It was not stars and stripes, it was the Russian flag. Very, very clear, symbolic. Page 45. This is one reason I'm sharing this is I always tell my students, to be a good writer, read widely. read excellent literature. And when you read things, don't be passive, but try to keep an eye of how is this writer doing a great job? And Giles Milton can just capture these amazing little snippets or stories. He had one very early on. I didn't mention this in part one, but at the Yalta conference, Churchill and a dying Roosevelt flew in all the way to the Soviet Union. Stalin came by train. He was afraid to travel by air because he was paranoid and evil. And so had this one conversation where Roosevelt and Stalin were chatting. And it was interesting to read this book that the Allies brought just tons of liquor to these meetings, both to Yalta in February and then Potsdam in July, just oceans of alcohol to kind of lubricate the conversation, so to speak. And had this one kind of an aside where Stalin and Roosevelt were chatting, and Stalin was the host because it was in the Soviet Union there in Yalta in the Crimean Peninsula. And Roosevelt made some comment about how to make a really good martini, you have to have fresh lemon, and we forgot to bring lemons with us. Stalin didn't say anything; he's kind of listened. Well, the next day, delivered to the palace where Roosevelt was staying was a live lemon tree full of fresh lemons that Stalin had ordered from Soviet Georgia. We probably all know there's a U.S. state called Georgia. There's also a small country on the east side of the Black Sea called Georgia. And in fact, Stalin was born there. He was not ethnic Russian. He was ethnic Georgian. And so Stalin heard that the president wanted lemons. And so during the night, he had this live tree brought in over, 1,000 miles or so, full of lemons. So this is little side notes, make this really good writing. So here's one about the end of April, early May, as the Russians are coming into Berlin. I mentioned a man named Simonov, who was a Soviet war correspondent, Konstantin Simonov. Simonov clambered over a wall and found himself inside the Berlin Zoo. The dazed zookeeper led him to the hippopotamus basin, where one of the hippos lay dead and bloated in the water, the stabilizer of a grenade protruding from its swollen belly. The other hippo wallowed sadly in the stagnant water. Quote, "It doesn't want to go near the corpse as if it knew the danger," wrote Simonov in his diary. In happier times, the nearby ape house had echoed with the whoops and cries of children. A sign proudly declared it was the home to the largest gorilla and chimpanzee in Europe. Simonov poked his head inside. Both had been shot dead and lay on the concrete floor in a pool of thickly congealed blood. The zookeeper was distraught, quote, standing there and shaking his head without saying anything. And he mentions a woman named Ruth Andreas Friedrich, who was a Berlin woman of some reputation and well-known, highly respected lady, intellectual. She kept a journal of all these things. So when Ruth Andreas Friedrich and three friends ventured outside for a second time, they saw a low, because maybe were hiding because of first had been the war and bombs falling. And once the Russians came in, they went on a looting spree and also a rape spree, which more or less the Russian military had given the men okay to do, saying, hey, we Russians suffered terribly during World War II with the Nazis, so now have at it and get back even. So many Berliners were hiding for that reason. So when Ruth Andreas Friedrich and three friends ventured outside for a second time, they saw a lone white ox lumbering among the rubble. They were so desperate for food that they dragged the animal into a nearby courtyard and killed it. Within seconds, emaciated Berliners began scrambling out of the surrounding ruins and fighting over the spoils. Quote, "They came running with buckets, with tubs and vats. Screaming and gesticulating, they tear pieces of meat from each other's hands. Somebody rinsed out the liver. Others snatched at the dripping tongue. Quote, 'The tongue is mine, the tongue, the tongue.' 5 blood-covered fists angrily pulled the tongue out of the ox's throat. At the rear of the beast, a shrill-voiced woman hacked off the tail and fled the scene in greedy triumph. Frau Andreas Friedrich felt profoundly depressed. Is this the moment we've waited for 12 years, that we might fight over an ox's liver?" So the evil irony of the Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. In 12 years, it ended by people fighting over raw meat and ox liver and ox tongue. It just shows that people are just so hungry. In those last few weeks, almost all order in the city had shut down, and people were starving to death. So just these little powerful snippets the author can include that make it very, 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 very moving. Okay, let's go on now. Skip forward some. So that was like late April, early May. Hitler kills himself. On May 8th, Germany surrenders. The war is over in Europe. Now, the war was continuing in Japan. World War II didn't end there until August, when we dropped atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But the war in Europe was over on May 8th. But what do you have? Germany was bombed into rubble. You had millions of displaced persons, refugees moving around. It was very, very heartbreaking. A lot of chaos. So let's go to page 108. And this is where I mentioned, I believe in the part 2, during the war, because Nazism is extreme right wing, a number of German communists, fearing for their lives, had fled Germany and went to Moscow. And Stalin, took these people under his wing and trained them. And so as Nazism was falling, these German leaders flew back into Berlin to set up a communist government. That was the goal. Walter Ulbricht was the leader of this group, okay? And so let's hear a little bit about how they took over. It's very, very sneaky. And I think there's some lessons for us today in the Western world about institutions being taken over, things looking democratic on the surface, but actually being dictatorship. The German communists said, hey, we have to make sure everything looks democratic on the surface, but in fact, we're just taking over. And because the Americans and British were delayed getting there, the idea was, strike while the iron is hot, come in and take over Berlin quickly these first few weeks. So once the Allies come, Berlin is more or less in communist hands. That was their goal. Okay, so this is page 108. The leader of the Lux Hotel Revolutionaries, that was a hotel in Moscow where these German communists had been staying during the war and meeting. The leader of these Lux Hotel Revolutionaries, Walter Ulbricht, had displayed a steely sense of purpose since his arrival in Berlin, focusing his energy on gaining mastery of the city's key institutions. He had done so with the active support of the Soviet military administration, but his work was now complicated by the arrival of the Western Allies. So once Frank Howley, the Americans came in, the British, it made things more complicated to take over the city because he had these allies, or maybe former allies, to deal with. This is going to be kind of about a 3-page longer quotation, but it's just so rich. I want to share this with you. Page 108. Frank Howley's agents were keeping a close eye on the Soviet-trained revolutionaries. So Frank Howley was the American colonel in charge of the American troops in Berlin. And these intelligence people were reporting back each new piece of intelligence. The first alarm bell sounded when it was discovered that Ulbricht's police chief, Paul Markgraf, was a Nazi turned communist. In this way, said Howley, quote, the Berlin police force was added to the communist ranks, giving them a powerful weapon. So in theory, the idea was these Nazi leaders were supposed to be removed from office and the whole culture be denazified. That was the theory, okay? And the Americans did this as well, so in many ways. But the Russians coming in, when they take over, would take these Nazi people, whether there's a police chief or the Berlin radio people we'll look at later on, and they would just say, hey, work for us now. And the Nazis realized, hey, there's a new sheriff in town. Hitler's dead. And so we need to make peace with these new people. And so a lot of times the Nazis just became communist operatives overnight. To be fair, many scientists did the same. There are a lot of Nazi scientists that the US were able to snatch up because we wanted them to help produce our nuclear bombs and space program and stuff. So both sides actually grabbed up quite a few of these former Nazi scientists. And the book goes into more detail about that topic. So this police chief was a Nazi turned communist. Next, it was discovered. So notice the importance of the police. We're seeing in America today a lot, the importance of police. And so by the communists running the police force, they had more or less their thugs, right? But they looked legit. They looked democratic. Oh, police uniform, but they're really just communist thugs. Next, it was discovered that Ulbricht had placed the judiciary in the hands of a communist activist named Mittag. Herr Mittag had no legal training. He was a locksmith by profession, but he had years of experience in coercion. Howley's assessment of the chief judge was scathing. In the United States, I doubt if Mittag, controller of all courts, would have gotten through grammar school. So this top judge was a locksmith, he had no legal experience, but he was a loyal communist. So there you go. Take over the court system, and you have a huge apparatus to get your will done. Ulbricht had also created a free German trade union federation, a body that was anything but free, because all union members were required to join. It bore no resemblance to the unions in the United States, observed Howley, who was told it was an organization with dictatorial powers. Now, even in America today, there are issues of, is union membership required or voluntary? We have that issue in America even today. As each new snippet of intelligence reached Howley's desk, a clear pattern began to emerge. Now, I've heard before, bright people look for patterns. You just can't memorize every little data point, but looking for patterns is important. Something deeply sinister was taking place under his very nose. All the institutions established in the first weeks of the Soviet occupation had the veneer of being democratic, but whenever Howley's agents looked at them more closely, they were found to be nothing of the sort. The city was in the hands of a puppet communist body headed by Moscow-trained Germans. No less disquieting was the discovery that the mayor, Arthur Werner, had no authority whatsoever. So the Russians installed this new mayor, who's kind of a weak-willed, spineless guy, Arthur Werner. Quote, real power was in the hands of Soviet tools like Deputy Mayor Miron, one of the Hotel Lux revolutionaries, so trained in Moscow. Frank Howley's liaison officer witnessed a graphic display of Karl Miron's ruthlessness while visiting the mayoral headquarters. Throwing a batch of papers onto Mayor Werner's desk, Miron ordered them to be signed. Quote, but I haven't read them yet, Werner protested. You cannot expect me to sign them without reading them. Sounds to me kind of like the Nancy Pelosi Obamacare, right? To find out what's in the bill, you have to pass the bill. So this vice mayor drops a bunch of papers and orders the mayor to sign them. The mayor protests. Sign, Miron commanded, and Werner did as he was told. So you got the vice mayor giving orders to the mayor and the mayor obeying. More surprising, but no less sinister, was Ulbricht's treatment of the many left-wing groups that had sprung up in the city since its capture. Now, Nazism is far right-wing, communism is far left-wing. So you'd think that these other left-wing groups would be natural allies of the communists. Not so. Continue. Instead of welcoming them as fellow travelers, Ulbricht viewed them as rivals to his intended grip on power. We must break them up at all costs, he told his Hotel Lux comrades. Quote, you must ensure their immediate dissolution. When one of them questioned the wisdom of such an action, Ulbricht revealed his autocratic streak. They're to be dissolved, he snapped, and at once. The youngest of the Lux group, Wolfgang Leonhardt, had no doubt as to what was taking place. Ulbricht was creating a Stalinist system that would brook no criticism. Comrades who declined to toe the party line would be eliminated rather than tolerated. Those who knew something of Ulbricht's background were not surprised. His job during the Spanish Civil War, that was in the 1930s, had been to liquidate anti-Stalinist fighters in Spain's Republican Army. The Hotel Lux group was now joined in Berlin by William Pieck, head of the exiled German Communist Party, who had served valedictory vodkas in his Moscow bedroom a few weeks earlier. An unknown figure to most Berliners, this carpenter turned activist soon appeared on Wilfred Byron Jones's radar screen. He was the British intelligence officer, sought out Pieck at a Soviet sector rally and found him, quote, a squat, blotchy-faced, white-haired man of about 70, with a resolute expression and wily eyes. Pieck was as dogmatically stubborn as Walter Ulbricht, and similarly lacking joie de vivre, which means no joy of life. Quote, his physique had not been broken by concentration camps, Byford Jones noted, and his convictions had been strengthened by indoctrination administered during his long stay in Russia. So during World War II, this guy, Peake, was in Moscow getting Russian training. Peake was close to Stalin, both ideologically and personally, and had been encouraged to Berlin to, quote, reinstate communism in the capital. Peake's goal was to turn the Communist Party into a mass movement that could sweep to power through the ballot box, albeit with the aid of coercion, bribery, and relentless propaganda. Byford Jones trailed the German revolutionaries with the assiduousness of a private detective, aware he was witnessing the opening moves in a secretive power grab. The real political battle in Berlin was at first underground, he wrote. One could live there as a foreigner and not be aware that a classic struggle between an international communism and the forces which will ever oppose it was in progress. He was dismayed by the policy emanating from London, whose politicians seemed entirely ignorant of the situation on the ground. They watched developments a little puzzled as to where the Russian bear was heading, he said, ever hoping for the best. So again, because Stalin had been an American ally during World War II, in these early days, May, June, July of 45, American and British leadership was very much Stalin's our ally, keep him, stay on his good side, don't upset him, don't make him think he can't trust us, that kind of thing. But Howley, this American colonel in Berlin, was one of the first ones to realize, wait a minute, we're being lied to. And our policy of treating this guy like a friend is going to be very naive and not work out very well. Harold Hayes, another one of the Allied leaders in Berlin, Harold Hayes had also been keeping an eye on Walter Ulbricht and was increasingly convinced that Berlin would be the stage set for a violent struggle between East and West. He had seen enough to conclude that Ulbricht's revolutionaries represented an existential threat to the Western sectors of Berlin. Quote, communism to them is not just a political dogma, he said, but a holy crusade. He felt they would be prepared to use force to achieve their goal, although he added an important caveat, quote, they are led by cunning leaders who prefer to attain their victory by other means, propaganda, falsehood, calumny, and every evil which can be stirred up by the written or spoken word. Frank Howley agreed with Hayes, having already concluded that American policy toward Berlin was as misguided as that of the British. Stalin's apparatchiks were simply not playing by the same rules. Howley was equally aware that when it came to dealing with the Soviets, the traditional American way of doing things was wholly inadequate. Quote, they'll promise anything, sign anything, provided it benefits them, and will scrap the pledge the moment it doesn't. It was a world away from life in Philadelphia, where Howley had been in the advertising business. Quote, American business is carried on by checks, which imply trust. The Russians are ideologically incapable of such a system because they would dishonor the signatures the next day if it happened to be expedient. Howley's first weeks in the German capital had opened his eyes in a way he had never thought possible. Quote, I had come to Berlin with the idea that the Germans were the enemies, he wrote. But it was becoming more evident by the day that it was the Russians who really were our enemies. This realization placed him in a dilemma. Should he continue to follow Washington's misguided policy, or should he develop his own more combative approach, one that risked rousing the fury of Joseph Stalin? It didn't take him long to find that answer. But before he could make his first move, he had to await the outcome of the much vaunted Potsdam Conference. Okay. And so section 1 began looking at the Yalta Conference in February 45. We'll look in the next section at the Potsdam Conference, July to early August of 45. It held in the outskirts of Berlin. Okay, so that's going to be up next. Thanks for watching.